there are declines from grace, and then there are situations like what Mahinda Rajapaksa is going through in Sri Lanka. He presided over the island nation's politics for the majority of the last 2 decades. First as president from 2005 to 2015 for a decade, and then following a brief interregnum as prime minister in an administration where his brother, Gotabaya, held the presidency. The Rajapaksa clan held sway over a number of state institutions, from commanding influence over key economic sectors to exercising control over the security forces. Let's dig deeper into how a single family was able to destroy a whole country in Sri Lanka. The long-running Tamil Tiger insurgency was brutally put down in the early years of Mahinda Rajapaksa's rule. Later on, however, the populist quasi-autocrat, who occasionally gave the impression that he was a warrior king, leaned heavily on majoritarian nationalist politics in an effort to win over the country's majority Sinhalese Buddhist population. The Rajapaksa family appeared to be at a low political point after losing the presidential race in 2015, but they stormed back to power in 2019 after the deadly Easter Sunday terrorist attacks, running on a platform of alleged national security credentials. But their reign of terror may now be finally coming to an end. The worst economic crisis to hit Sri Lanka since its independence is sweeping the island nation. A cascading series of problems such as soaring inflation, mounting public debt, and depleting foreign exchange reserves make it difficult for the nation to import basic necessities, and prices for food and fuel have increased dramatically in recent months. The 22 million people living in the country are in complete darkness due to power outages. Some aid organizations compared the state of Sri Lankan hospitals to a humanitarian catastrophe due to shortages of medical supplies and medications. Rajapaksa was forced to resign as prime minister after weeks of widespread protests against his administration and deadly street violence on Monday. With his resignation, he became the 4th member of his family to resign from a prominent position within a month, joining his son Namal, who was the Minister of Sports and Youth Affairs, his brothers Basil and Shamal, who are currently serving as former ministers of finance and irrigation respectively. But the main focus is on President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is the most egregious example of a long nepotistic chain. Angry Sri Lankans from all walks of life have been attending the days-long, largely peaceful protests taking place across the nation. They gathered in Colombo at the well-known Gale Face waterfront promenade and transformed it into a sort of Tahrir Square on the Indian Ocean. A carnival of activism complete with tent encampments, temporary public libraries, and health and food facilities. The Rajapaksas would leave first was their unambiguous message. Eventually, protesters at the Gale Place site were violently attacked by pro-government supporters who were likely bussed into the city by Rajapaksa and his allies. Some say that attack sparked a wave of furious retaliation. The Rajapaksas and their allies' homes were set on fires as vigilantes poured into the streets, chased after and beat up government supporters. The former prime minister reportedly fled to a military base in the nation's northeast by dawn of the next day, where he was quickly surrounded by irate citizens. Uncertainty pervades the nation as Gotabaya struggles to maintain his political grip and calls for the formation of an interim unity government, which few members of the opposition are now willing to support as long as he retains power. While this was going on, Sri Lankan negotiators were supposed to start talking to the IMF. The nation went into default on its debts last month, in part as a result of the global upheavals brought on by the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. According to analysts, there is little chance of an economic recovery because of the uncertainty surrounding the nation's leadership. Paikya Soti Saravanamuttu, executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives in Colombo, commented that a political solution was required before anything could take place. You require a trustworthy government. Right now, the presidency is a poison chalice. Critics of Rajapaksa would contend that his family was largely to blame for the poisoning. This includes years of violence against, intimidation, and harassment of journalists and civil society groups, widespread and documented allegations of war crimes and human rights violations that accompanied the Sri Lankan military's 2009 offensive against Tamil rebels, stoking of ethno-religious tensions, and including the covert cultivation of orders of extremist militant Buddhist monks who have killed thousands of civilians. Then, there was also their approach to managing the economy. The Rajapaksas Rajapaksa's increased military spending even during times of peace and engaged in a form of crony capitalism that most likely increased the family's wealth. They referred to significant Chinese-funded infrastructure projects that not only turned out to be wasteful white elephants, but also made Sri Lanka one of the world's top examples of what happens when a country becomes indebted to Beijing, such as a port in Hambantota, the hometown of their family. The pandemic and war in Ukraine, according to critics, were not the root causes of the current crisis. No sincere observer believed the country would be able to pay back the $29 billion in debt it owed over the next 5 years, or nearly the $7 billion in debt it owed this year, according to Amita Arut Pragasam in Foreign Policy. But Sri Lanka's government, which was largely composed of Rajapaksa family members and supporters, was supported by Sinhalese Buddhist supremacists, crony capitalists, the state-owned media, and a few significant private media outlets. It continued to gaslight its citizens. The protest movement's tenacity and persistence seem to indicate that gaslighting is no longer effective. According to Dilrushki Handuneti, a journalist from Sri Lanka, the protests' scale and organic growth showed that the Rajapaksas were no longer the popular political family that they once were. There were demands for forensic audits, the return of stolen property, and legal action against Rajapaksas in addition to calls for collective resignations. The family was blamed for the island's financial collapse. As the nation struggles with both political dysfunction and severe economic pain, difficult times are ahead. According to Sharika Tiranagama, an anthropologist at Stanford University, in Sri Lanka we were an extremely divided country, not in a facile sense, but because of decades of war and ethnic violence and deep cruelty towards each other in many ways. But she characterized the demonstrations as an expression of solidarity and hope. This is an example of a democratic mobilization. People are demanding basic rights to dignity and accountability for corruption, she said. This has been very nourishing at a time when I really needed it. So that's the end of the video. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and press the notification bell so you never miss out on our next videos. Until the next video, take care.